Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. Tony Salab was a palace of innovation, every surface filled with the raw potential of invention. Tall windows let in the midday sun, gleaming against the smooth metal of prototypes and the endless tools that littered his workbenches. In the center of the chaos, Tony stood holding his newest creation with reverence. The mechanical arm rested in his hands, sleek and silver, like a weapon from the future. But this wasn't a weapon, at least not in Tony's eyes. It was humanity, Cell next step forward. He had spent years perfecting the design, ensuring that this arm would be able to grant ordinary people extraordinary abilities, superhuman strength, agility, and precision, all within the reach of anyone willing to use it. Tony smiled to himself. He could already see the changes this would bring. Construction workers, soldiers, even those who had lost limbs, this technology could empower them all. With this invention, there would be no more limitations. Humans could finally break free from their natural weaknesses. He placed the arm on the table beside him and walked toward the large screen mounted on the wall. A news feed scrolled across the bottom of the display, but Tony wasn't interested in world events today. His mind was already working on the future. He tapped a few keys on the nearby console, bringing up the specifications for the arm's iteration. The door to the lab slid open with a quiet hiss, and Clark entered, his presence as calm and composed as ever. Clark was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face marked by deep lines of contemplation. He was Tony's oldest friend, though. They couldn't have been more different. Where Tony saw only possibilities, Clark saw dangers. Where Tony charged ahead, Clark often held him back, urging caution and deliberation. "Still working on that thing, huh?" Clark said, his tone neutral, but Tony could hear the undercurrent of disapproval. Tony didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the screen. "Yeah. And it said almost ready. This version is going to be the one I can feel it." Clark crossed the room and stopped beside the workbench, eyeing the mechanical arm with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "I don't know, Tony. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I'm not sure it's at the right path." What happens when everyone has one of these? What happens when people start using it for the wrong reason? Tony finally turned to face his friend, his expression softening. He had heard this argument before. Clark had always been the philosopher, the one who worried about the moral implications of technology, while Tony was the creator, the visionary. "Look, I get it," Tony said, "but this isn't about giving power to the wrong people. It's about giving power to everyone. You've had to see the numbers. Clark, people are struggling. They're working themselves to the bone just to get by. This could change that." Clark folded his arms across his chest. "And what about the cost? Not just in dollars, but in terms of what it does to us as human beings. You think giving someone superhuman strength doesn't change who they are? Doesn't change how they see themselves?" Tony shrugged, trying to brush off Clark's concerns, but they hit closer to home than he wanted to admit. He had thought about these things briefly, but in his mind, the benefits far outweighed the risk. "I trust people," Tony said. "I trust that they'll use this technology the right way. If we don't, you innovate. If we don't, you push forward. We'll just be stuck in the same place forever." Clark's eyes darkened, and for a moment, the tension between them felt palpable. But Clark, always the calm one, sighed and let his arms drop to his side. "I just want you to think about it, Tony. Once you put this out there, you can take it back. You can control what happens next." Tony's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You've always been the cautious one, but trust me on this. It's going to be great." The unveiling of the mechanical arm was a spectacle, just as Tony had planned it. He stood on a stage in front of a crowd of reporters, scientists, and curious onlookers. A large screen behind him displayed images of the arm in action, lifting weights that no human could manage, moving with the grace and speed of a professional athlete. The audience was captivated. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tony began, his voice strong and confident, "what you're looking at is not just an invention. It's a revolution. This arm can grant anyone the ability to perform feats they never thought possible. And I'm not just talking about strength. With the right programming, it can enhance dexterity, reflexes, endurance, all of it. Imagine the possibilities: construction workers who can lift 10 times their body weight, soldiers who can run faster and hit harder than ever before, or even people who've lost limbs being able to regain their independence." The crowd murmured in awe, their eyes fixed on the gleaming metal of the arm on display. Tony felt a surge of pride. This was his moment, the culmination of years of work. He had done it. He had created something that would change the world. But as he spoke, he caught sight of Clark standing at the back of the crowd, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Tony felt a twinge of discomfort. He knew Clark didn't improve, but surely once he saw the potential, he would come around. Of course, Tony continued, with great power comes great responsibility. This is a tool, not a toy. And it's signed up to all of us to use it wisely, to ensure that it benefits society as a whole. As the applause erupted, Tony smiled and waved, but his thoughts drifted back to his friend. He would have to talk to Clark later, make him see that this was a good thing. That conversation would have to wait. Just 2 days after the unveiling, reports of violence began flooding the news. People were using mechanical arms that looked eerily similar to Tony's invention in criminal act. Banks were being robbed, civilians attacked, all by individuals wielding the strength of Tony Surrey's creation. Tony sat in front of the television in his lab, watching the footage with a sinking feeling in his stomach. His mechanical arm, his masterpiece, was being used for destruction. He couldn't believe it. All had things spiraled out of control so quickly. A loud knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He stood and crossed the room, opening the door to find Clark standing there, a grim look on his face. "Tony, we need to talk," Clark said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Tony ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him. "I know what you were going to say, and I don't want to hear it right now." Clark's eyes narrowed. "This isn't here about being right or wrong, Tony. This is about stopping this madness before it gets worse. You have to do something. You have to take responsibility for this." Tony turned away, unable to meet his friend's gaze. "I didn't tell you to do this, Clark. I didn't tell people to use it like this. But you made it possible," Clark said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You opened the door, and now the wrong people are walking through it. We have to shut it down before more people get hurt." Tony felt a surge of defensiveness rise within him. "I never wanted it. It was supposed to help people. It was supposed to make the world a better place." "I know that," Clark said, stepping closer, "but you can control how people use what you've created. To some point, I've been trying to make technology is powerful, and when it's misused, it's dangerous. We can't just sit by and hope it gets better. We have to act." Tony slumped into a chair, his mind racing. Clark was right. As much as he wanted to deny it, the responsibility was his. He had created the mechanical arm, and now it was being used to harm innocent people. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. "Okay," Tony said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do?" The plan was ambitious, but it was their only option. Tony would develop an override mechanism that could remotely shut down all the mechanical arms currently in circulation. It would be difficult, nearly impossible, given how many had already been produced and distributed by the black market, but Tony was determined to make it work. Meanwhile, Clark would focus on gathering information about the villain behind the attack. Through contacts in law enforcement and the tech community, they learned that the mastermind was none other than Victor, a disgraced scientist who had once worked alongside Tony before being ousted for unethical practices. Victor had somehow gotten his hands on the blueprints for the mechanical arm and had started mass-producing them for his criminal empire. He had outfitted his henchmen with the arms, using them to wreak havoc across the city, targeting banks, government buildings, and key infrastructure. His plan was to destabilize society and seize control, using the mechanical arms as the foundation for his new order. "This is worse than I thought," Tony said one evening, as he and Clark pored over the information they had gathered. "Victor's not just using the arms for petty crimes. He is trying to tear the whole system down." Clark nodded grimly. "He's built an army, Tony, and it sounds all because of your invention. We have to stop him before it sounds too late." Tony's hands trembled as he worked on the override device, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like a vice. He had never wanted this. He had never imagined that his creation could cause so much destruction, but now it was his job to fix it. In the dead of night, Tony and Clark led a small team of resistance fighters into the heart of Victor Shi territory. The streets were dark and eerily quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of machinery and the occasional crackle of static from their radio. Victor's headquarters was a fortress heavily guarded by men and women equipped with mechanical arms. Tony's heart raced as they approached, knowing that the fate of the city and perhaps even the world rested on their success. As they infiltrated the compound, slipping past guards and disabling security systems, Tony couldn't shake the feeling of guilt gnawing at it. Every time he saw one of Victor's henchmen wielding the stolen technology, it was a reminder of the role he had played in this disaster. They reached the control room where Tony could deploy the override signal. But just as he was about to activate it, the door burst open and Victor himself strode in, flanked by two of his most heavily armed lieutenants. "Tony," Victor said, his voice smooth and mocking, "I was wondering when you do show up. You really thought you could waltz in here and shut me down?" Tony froze as Victor's words sliced through the tension in the room. The man who now stood before him was not the scientist he once knew. Victor had transformed his once calm demeanor, twisted into something sinister, something dangerous. The mechanical arm strapped to Victor's right side gleamed in the dim light, an upgraded version of Tony's invention, enhanced with features that Tony could only guess at. "I am not here to argue," Tony said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I am here to shut you down." Victor chuckled, a low menacing sound. "Oh, Tony, always so noble, so self-righteous. But you see, it's too late. The world is changing, whether you like it or not. Your precious morality means nothing in the face of power. And with these arms, I control that power." Tony could see the confidence radiating off of Victor. His once colleague had always been ambitious, but now that ambition had warped into something far more dangerous. Victor believed that might made right, that technology could be used to bend the world to his will, and he had the tools to make it happen. Clark stepped forward, placing himself between Tony and Victor. His expression was cold, controlled. "You were wrong, Victor. This isn't about power, it's about responsibility, and you've failed that test." Victor's eyes flashed with anger, and in a blur of motion, he raised his mechanical arm and swung it toward Clark. Clark barely had time to react before the fist connected with his chest, sending him crashing into the far wall with a sickening thud. Tony shouted, rushing to his friend's side, but Clark waved him off, struggling to get to his feet. "I am fine," Clark gasped, clutching his side, focused on stopping him. "Tony," his heart pounded in his chest as he turned back to Victor. His mind raced, trying to think of a way to outsmart his old colleague. The override device was still in his hand, but he knew it wouldn't work on Victor's high arm, not without some modification. Victor had anticipated this move, and Tony realized too late that he had underestimated the villain's cunning. Victor advanced on him, moving with the enhanced speed and precision granted by the arm. "You can't win, Tony," he sneered. "This is the future, and I am the one holding the rein." But Tony wasn't ready to give up. He had created this technology. He understood its weaknesses. And as Victor loomed closer, a plan began to form in his mind. Victor swung again, but this time Tony was ready. He dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the blow, and used the momentum to slip behind Victor. In a single fluid motion, Tony yanked the control panel off Victor's arm, exposing the internal wiring. Victor roared in anger, spinning around to face him. But Tony didn't stop. He dove for the nearby console, pulling up the override center face. His fingers flew across the keys as he modified the signal, targeting the specific frequency of Victor's arm. He could hear Victor approaching, his footsteps heavy with rage, but Tony kept working, driven by sheer determination. Just as Victor reached him, Tony hit the final key. The override signal pulsed through the room, and with a sputter of electricity, Victor's arm went dead. Victor's expression twisted into one of disbelief as he looked down at his now useless mechanical arm. No, this isn't possible. Tony stood, his chest heaving with exhaustion. "It's over. Victor, you lost." For a moment, Victor stood frozen, his eyes wide with fury. Then, with a guttural growl, he lunged at Tony, his good arm swinging wildly. But without the enhancement of the mechanical arm, Victor's movements were clumsy, slow. Tony sidestepped him easily, and with a swift motion, he delivered a punch to Victor's sending him sprawling to the ground. Victor lay there, groaning in pain, his empire crumbling around him. Tony stood over him, his mind racing with everything that had led to this moment. The destruction, the chaos, the lives lost, all because of the technology he had created. He had nearly lost himself to it, blinded by his ambition, but Clark had been right all along. With great power came great responsibility, and Tony had failed to see the dangers until it was almost too late. Clark limped over to him, breathing heavily, but managing a faint smile. "You did it." Tony shook his head, staring down at Victor's defeated form. "We did it." The aftermath was chaotic, but the city slowly began to recover. Victor's army, now without their enhanced strength, scattered, and law enforcement was able to regain control. Tony worked tirelessly with the authorities to dismantle the remaining mechanical arms, ensuring that none of his technology would fall into the wrong hands again. Weeks later, Tony and Clark stood side by side at the edge of the city, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was quiet, peaceful, a stark contrast to the violence that had threatened to consume everything. "You were right," Tony said quietly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I was so caught up in the possibilities that I didn't stop to think about the consequences. I should have listened to you." Clark glanced at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's not about being right, Tony. It's all about learning from our mistakes. What matters is that you did the right thing in the end." Tony sighed, his thoughts heavy. I don't know if I can keep doing this. Creating things, pushing the boundaries of what is possible. It feels like every time I try to help, I end up causing more harm. Clark was silent for a moment. Then he placed a hand on Tony's shoulder. "You can test up being who you are, Tony. You read a creator, a visionary. But maybe it's time to think about how your inventions fit into the bigger picture. Technology isn't inherently good or bad. It's how we use it that matters. And if anyone can find that balance, it's you." Tony nodded, though doubt still lingered in the back of his mind. He had always believed that innovation was the key to a better future, but now he saw the need for caution, for responsibility. He would continue to create, but he would never again let his ambition blind him to the consequences. As they stood there, watching the fading light of day, Tony felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead would be difficult, but he wasn't walking it alone. With Clark by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges the future held. The world had changed, and so had Tony, but with change came growth, and Tony was ready to build something new, something better. Together, they turned away from the horizon and headed back into the city, ready to face whatever came next.